John Lennon rarely handed out compliments, least of all to himself or the Beatles. After the breakup, he openly dismantled his own catalog, dismissing songs as lazy, albums as bloated, and even untouchable classics as flawed. Yet, buried beneath the bitterness were flashes of clarity, moments when Lennon admitted certain songs mattered because they felt honest, not because they sold or were adored. These were the rare tracks he continued to respect, even as he distanced himself from much of the Beatles' legacy. That list opens with a song born from borrowed rhythm and reshaped into something distinctly Lennon. Number 10, Come Together, 1969. Originally written as a loose political chant for Timothy Leary's failed campaign, the song was murky and unrefined. When the campaign collapsed, Lennon reclaimed it, darkened its tone, and openly acknowledged lifting its groove from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me. For Lennon, the point wasn't originality, it was identity, and Come Together sounded unmistakably like him. Its lyrics leaned into surreal ambiguity, prioritizing feeling over logic. Lennon admired that it didn't explain itself, it simply moved. What stayed with him was the restraint. No excess, just a heavy pulse and a vocal that felt both intimate and dangerous. Years later, he still counted it among the few Beatles songs that felt real. Number 9, Your Blues, 1968. This song emerged from confinement, both emotional and physical, during the White Album sessions. Lennon felt alienated from the Beatles' polished image and wanted the music to reflect suffocation, not success. He forced the band into a cramped side room, rejecting comfort in favor of claustrophobia. The result was intentionally wrong. The amps buzzed, the drums felt boxed in, the guitar cut with grit rather than clarity. Nothing was refined, and that was the release. Though some lyrics exaggerated blues cliches, the despair underneath was genuine, Lennon mocking pain while drowning in it. He later said it was one of the few Beatles songs he truly believed in because it refused to pretend everything was fine. Number 8, Help, 1965. At the height of Beatlemania, Lennon was unraveling. Though the song sounded bright and radio-ready, it was born from exhaustion and fear. Fame, constant touring, and lost privacy left him overwhelmed, even as the band moved efficiently through the sessions. Recorded quickly and cleanly, the song's sped-up tempo masked its vulnerability. Lennon sang with urgency, nearly shouting, while cheerful harmonies softened the blow. That contrast later troubled him. He wished he'd stripped it down and slowed it back, because beneath the polish, Help wasn't pop, it was a plea to survive. Number 7, Revolution, 1968. This song grew out of turmoil, political, personal, and internal to the band. Lennon absorbed protests, radical ideas, and Yoko Ono's influence, but arrived in the studio unsure of his own position. Revolution wasn't a statement, it was a question. Two versions reflected that conflict. Lennon favored a slow, heavy take filled with doubt, while McCartney pushed for urgency and clarity. Both were recorded. The fast single, drenched in distortion, captured Lennon's anger. The sound was harsh by design. He wanted it to feel uncomfortable. Lyrically, the uncertainty remained. Lines like "Count me out," "in," revealed his hesitation, drawn to change, yet wary of extremism. That tension, unresolved and exposed, is why Revolution endured for him. The session was clouded by ambiguity from the start. Even those present weren't sure what the song was saying, which was precisely the point. Years later, Lennon admitted the track still felt unresolved to him. Even so, he placed Revolution above many Beatles songs, not for its message, but for how fearlessly it captured uncertainty in real time. Number 6, I Am the Walrus, 1967. From its conception, confusion was intentional. Lennon wrote it while actively resisting expectations, as fans obsessed over decoding Beatles lyrics. He found that obsession absurd, so his response was calculated nonsense. Chaos was already embedded by the time recording began. Lennon stitched together pieces born from clashing moods, hostile, playful, and deliberately ridiculous. The bizarre imagery wasn't decoration, it was the core idea. That philosophy carried straight into production. Lennon pushed for distortion, heavy cellos, piercing brass, radio static, and even stray dialogue from a BBC King Lear broadcast. George Martin later called it one of their most draining sessions. There was no roadmap, only Lennon's insistence that the track overwhelm the listener. The atmosphere stayed unsettled. Paul and George played on instinct, while Martin struggled to keep the song from imploding. As it swelled louder and stranger, it drifted far from pop, and that thrilled Lennon. He later singled it out for one reason: it confused people. To him, I Am the Walrus wasn't art or protest, it was disruption, meant to derail interpretation. That disruption felt like freedom. By pressing chaos onto tape, the Beatles proved confusion itself could be creative. Number 5, Tomorrow Never Knows, 1966. This was the point where Lennon moved beyond songwriting and into sound design. When he introduced it at Abbey Road, it hardly resembled a traditional song. Structure, chords, and melody were absent, only an idea remained. He wanted it to resemble monks chanting from the mountaintop. That single vision reshaped the entire process. The studio grew tense as something unfamiliar took form. McCartney plunged into tape loop experimentation. Sounds were sliced, reversed, and layered. Bird-like cries, backward guitars, warped orchestral bits. The control room turned experimental. Martin later said it felt closer to avant-garde composition than pop. Lennon insisted the track sit on a single chord, drawing from Indian drones and the psychedelic experience. Ringo's slowed, trance-like drumming pulled it even further from rock. Then Lennon made one last demand. He rejected a normal vocal, insisting his voice pass through a rotating Leslie speaker to sound distant and weightless. Martin hesitated, but Lennon wouldn't budge. Years later, Lennon called it his greatest Beatles recording, not for tune, but for what it changed. That day, the band did more than cut a song. They tore down pop's rules and rebuilt them from scratch. Number 4, Across the Universe, 1969. The song was born from irritation, and traces of that emotion lingered. Lennon wrote it late one night in 1967 after a fight with Cynthia. He later described the words as pouring out non-stop, as if he had no say in stopping them. That uncontrollable flow became the song's foundation. Ideas wandered freely, uncensored, and relentless. By the time Lennon introduced it in the studio, he sensed its importance, even if its direction remained unclear. Early sessions at Abbey Road felt oddly subdued. The room carried a quiet, almost detached energy. Compared to the disciplined intensity of Tomorrow Never Knows, this track felt exposed. Lennon's vocal came across as soft, inward-looking, and unusually open. McCartney and Harrison played sparingly, careful not to upset the song's fragile equilibrium. Ironically, that caution soon became its weakness. George Martin later acknowledged the song never fully settled into a final version. Numerous takes followed, faster, slower, layered, stripped down. Lennon grew frustrated, believing each version sounded either too polished or too thin. The refrain, "Nothing's going to change my world," mimicked the sessions themselves, calm on the surface, but unsettled beneath. Lennon would later praise it as one of his finest songs while criticizing nearly every released take. Inside the studio, Across the Universe lingered unfinished, brilliance still searching for form. That unresolved pull between clarity and dissatisfaction is what ultimately gives the song its eerie, enduring power. Number 3. In My Life, 1965. In my life, there are places I remember. In My Life marked the point when Lennon realized he could write truthfully without disguises or defiance. The song didn't begin that way. His first concept resembled a personal journal, cataloging childhood Liverpool in detail. Verse after verse listed streets, bus lines, and familiar places. When George Martin heard it, he immediately sensed the problem. It sounded accurate, but emotionally hollow. Martin urged John to abandon geography and focus instead on what those places represented. That advice reshaped the song completely. When recording began later in 1965, Abbey Road felt unusually contemplative. There was no urgency, no experimentation, no tension. Lennon sang softly, restrained, almost afraid of pushing too hard. His voice felt closer and more personal than most Beatles tracks of the era. McCartney helped shape the melody, but stepped aside, recognizing this was Lennon's statement. Harrison's guitar remained understated, and then came George Martin's defining choice. The Baroque-style keyboard solo, recorded at half speed to resemble a harpsichord, transformed the track. Martin later said it marked a turning point not only for the band, but for Lennon. For the first time, John stopped addressing listeners and began addressing himself. Years later, he would name In My Life as one of the few Beatles songs he genuinely cherished. That day in the studio felt like an ending and the start of something far more reflective. Number 2. A Day in the Life, 1967. I read the news today, oh boy. A Day in the Life felt less like recording music and more like igniting something volatile. When Lennon brought it to Abbey Road in early 1967, the song was fragmented and intentionally disorienting. His verses were distant and observational, drawn from headlines and ordinary disasters. He delivered them with calm detachment, as if reporting events he no longer belonged to. The studio mood shifted instantly. Everyone sensed this wasn't typical Beatles territory. McCartney's section arrived later, bright and energetic, describing routines and missed buses. The contrast was deliberate and dangerous. Two emotional realities were being sewn together, with no guarantee they'd align. George Martin became the structural force holding it together. During the orchestral overdub, the atmosphere turned surreal and tense. 40 classical musicians were told to abandon discipline, beginning at the lowest note and rising to the highest, unleashing controlled chaos. Confusion rippled through the room. Some laughed uneasily. Others wondered if the band had finally gone too far. Lennon and McCartney watched silently, amused yet focused. This wasn't rebellion for spectacle, it was deliberate disorder. Martin later called it one of the most technically demanding sessions he'd ever managed. Chaos had to be shaped without losing command. The final piano chord, struck together by Lennon, McCartney, Starr, and Martin, rang out and dissolved into silence. No one spoke. Everyone understood something irreversible had happened. Lennon later said, "A Day in the Life proved the Beatles weren't competing with other bands anymore. We were competing with what was possible." Number 1. Strawberry Fields Forever, 1967. Let me take you down. Strawberry Fields Forever wasn't just a song, it was Lennon reconstructing his childhood from broken pieces. When he arrived at Abbey Road with the demo in late 1966, the tone was already changed. He seemed withdrawn, uncertain, deeply inward-looking. The song emerged from memory rather than melody. Strawberry Field, a Salvation Army home near his childhood, had become a symbol of lost innocence and emotional dislocation. Lennon warned George Martin before recording began, this one mattered. The problem was that Lennon himself didn't know how it should sound. Two completely different versions took shape. One was soft and dreamlike, built around mellotron and gentle rhythms. The other was darker, heavier, faster, and densely arranged. Lennon loved both and refused to choose. Frustrated, he turned to Martin with an impossible request. Could the ending of one be joined to the beginning of the other? Martin initially said it was impossible. The keys, tempos, and moods didn't match. Then he found a solution. Through tape manipulation, speed adjustments, and meticulous editing, the two takes were fused. It was a technical breakthrough unheard of in pop music at the time. During the edit, the studio fell quiet, focused, and reverent. Everyone knew they were witnessing the future being assembled by hand. Lennon's vocal drifted between clarity and distortion, echoing the uncertainty of the lyrics. Nothing is real. The backward sounds, warped brass, and unstable rhythm weren't embellishments, they were the structure itself. Years later, Lennon called Strawberry Fields Forever his most truthful Beatles song. George Martin described it as the moment studios stopped documenting music and started becoming instruments. In that room, surrounded by razor blades, tape loops, and fractured memories, the Beatles didn't just create a song, they transformed what music could be.